Your seat is in the back tonight, Helen. It's better if you stay out of the photographs, my husband whispered as we entered the ballroom. And in that moment, after 42 years of marriage, I realized Richard Whitmore was ashamed of me. I smiled anyway. I had spent nearly 2 hours getting ready for the Mercer Foundation gala, carefully curling my silver hair and fastening the pearl earrings my mother left me before she passed away. The navy satin dress I wore was simple but elegant, the kind of dress a woman my age chooses when she still wants to feel graceful without appearing desperate to look young. Richard barely looked at me during the drive into downtown Chicago. He spent most of the ride answering emails on his phone while the city lights reflected against the tinted windows of our black sedan. The Mercer Grand Hotel was glowing when we arrived, its towering glass entrance surrounded by luxury cars and sharply dressed guests stepping onto the red carpet beneath crystal chandeliers visible through the windows. I had attended these events years ago when Richard's company was smaller and our lives still felt shared. Back then he used to hold my hand proudly. Somewhere along the way, that stopped. Remember, he said quietly as the valet opened my door, these people are investors. Just relax and let me handle the conversations tonight. I nodded slowly, even though something sharp twisted in my chest. Inside, the ballroom shimmered with gold light and soft piano music. Women in designer gowns laughed beside marble columns, while waiters carried trays of champagne through the crowd. Richard immediately straightened his posture the moment he spotted familiar executives across the room. It amazed me how quickly he transformed around wealthy people, his voice deeper, his smile sharper, his entire personality polished into someone almost unrecognizable. Richard, a tall man, called near the stage. My husband lit up instantly. "Excuse me for a second," he muttered before walking away without introducing me to anyone standing nearby. I stood alone beside an enormous floral arrangement of white roses and lilies, pretending not to notice couples glancing at me. Before looking away, after several minutes, a young hostess approached carrying seating cards on a silver tray. "Mrs. Whitmore?" she asked politely. "Yes." She searched the tray once, then again more slowly. Her smile faded slightly. "I'm sorry, I don't seem to have a place card for you." Before I could answer, Richard suddenly appeared beside us. "It's fine," he interrupted quickly. "She'll sit at the auxiliary table near the back." The hostess looked confused, but the auxiliary section is usually reserved for assistants and event staff. Richard gave a short laugh. "Helen prefers quiet spaces." He didn't look at me when he said it. The hostess handed me a plain white card with table 27 written in black ink. No name, just a number. Richard adjusted his cufflinks and lowered his voice. "Don't make this awkward." Then he walked away again, disappearing into a crowd of wealthy strangers while I stood there holding a blank seating card like proof that I no longer belonged beside my own husband. I made my way toward the back corner of the ballroom, where table 27 sat half-hidden beside the catering station. From there I could see Richard laughing near the stage, one hand resting comfortably on the shoulder of a young blonde woman in a silver dress. He looked happier standing beside her than he had looked beside me in years. I folded my napkin carefully to stop my hands from trembling. Then, just as I lowered my eyes toward the untouched glass of water in front of me, the entire room seemed to shift. The conversation softened. People near the entrance suddenly turned their heads. And when I looked up, I saw Daniel Mercer himself standing across the ballroom staring directly at me with an expression of complete disbelief, as though he had just seen someone return from the dead. For a moment, I thought Daniel Mercer was looking at someone behind me. Men like him did not notice women sitting alone beside catering stations, especially not women with silver hair and a forgotten seat assignment. But he kept staring directly at me as he crossed the ballroom floor, slowly at first, then faster, ignoring the people trying to stop him along the way. Conversations faded around us. I could feel it happening without turning my head. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Laughter disappeared. Even the piano player seemed uncertain for a second. Daniel Mercer stopped only a few feet from my table. Up close, he looked older than the business magazine suggested. His dark hair had gone mostly gray, and the lines around his eyes were deeper now. But I recognized him immediately. Some faces stay with you no matter how many years pass. He looked at me carefully, almost cautiously, like he was afraid I might vanish if he blinked. "Helen Parker," he said quietly. "Not Whitmore. Parker. My maiden name." I felt my fingers tighten around the cloth napkin in my lap. Nobody at this gala knew that name. Nobody had called me that in decades. I cannot believe this, he whispered. I have been searching for you for 30 years. The room around us seemed to disappear. My heart beat so hard I could hear it in my ears. Daniel Mercer pulled out the empty chair across from me and sat down without waiting for permission. Something powerful men almost never do. You disappeared, he said. After Boston. After the expansion proposal. One day you were there, and then suddenly nobody could find you. I swallowed carefully before answering. Life changed. His expression softened slightly, but there was something unsettled in his eyes. Do you have any idea how many times I tried to track you down? Before I could respond, I noticed Richard moving toward us from across the ballroom. Fast. Too fast. His smile looked forced now. Nervous. Daniel, Richard said loudly as he approached. I see you have met my wife. Daniel did not even look at him. His attention stayed fixed on me. Met her, he repeated calmly. Richard, your wife is the reason Mercer Holdings survived 1989. The silence that followed felt enormous. I looked up and saw several executives nearby, turning toward us openly now. One woman nearly dropped her champagne glass. Richard gave a short laugh that sounded painfully unnatural. I think there has been some misunderstanding. No, Daniel said quietly. The misunderstanding is that this woman has spent 30 years being invisible while men accepted credit for work she should have been celebrated for. Richard's face lost color so quickly it frightened me. And for the first time in many years, I realized my husband was not embarrassed of me at all. He was afraid of me. Richard reached for my arm, but I quietly pulled my hand away before he could touch me. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, yet I saw the panic flicker across his face immediately. Daniel Mercer leaned back slightly in his chair, studying him with an expression that had lost all warmth. You never told me Helen was your wife, Daniel said. Richard forced another smile. Well, Helen never liked the business world very much. I lowered my eyes toward the untouched glass of water in front of me because the lie was almost too familiar to surprise me anymore. Over the years, Richard had repeated versions of it so many times that eventually even I had stopped correcting people. Helen prefers staying home. Helen gets overwhelmed at large events. Helen is happier away from corporate matters. Little by little, my absence became my personality. Daniel looked back at me carefully. Is that true? He asked. The ballroom felt strangely quiet now. I could sense people nearby pretending not to listen while hearing every word. I folded the edge of the napkin once more before answering softly. I used to enjoy the work. Daniel let out a slow breath through his nose, almost disappointed. Enjoy it, he repeated. Helen, you were brilliant at it. Richard shifted uncomfortably beside the table. Daniel, perhaps this is not the best place for old stories. Old stories built my company, Daniel replied coldly. Then he turned toward me again. Do you remember the conference room on Lexington Avenue? Winter of 1989. Everybody in that room wanted us to shut the expansion down. You were the only person who thought we could survive. The memory hit me so suddenly I could almost smell the burnt coffee from that tiny office again. Snow falling outside dirty windows. My yellow legal pad covered in handwritten projections. Daniel pacing across the room while investors threatened to walk away. I had been 29 years old and 6 months pregnant at the time, sitting in an oversized wool sweater because none of my business clothes fit anymore. Richard had stood beside me back then too. Quiet. Watching. Listening. Learning. You stayed awake for nearly 40 hours rewriting that proposal, Daniel continued. When the investors approved the expansion, they thought the strategy came from my senior team. He paused. It came from you. A younger executive standing nearby frowned slightly. Wait, he said carefully. Are you talking about the Midwest logistics model Mercer used in the early 90s? Daniel nodded once. Helen designed the foundation for it. The man stared at me with open disbelief. Across the ballroom, more people had started watching openly now. I noticed a woman whispering into another guest's ear while glancing toward our table. Richard loosened his tie slightly, his face growing tight around the jaw. Helen was helping out, he said quickly. We were all contributing ideas back then. Daniel's eyes hardened. No, Richard, he said quietly. Some people contribute ideas. Other people change entire industries. For the first time in decades, I felt something inside me begin to wake up. Not anger, not revenge, something colder, something steadier. The terrifying realization that my husband had not spent 40 years protecting me from the business world. He had spent 40 years protecting the business world from discovering me. Daniel remained seated beside me while the noise of the ballroom slowly returned around us, although nothing sounded quite the same anymore. People were speaking again, but softer now. Careful, curious. I noticed several guests pretending to study auction brochures while openly watching our table. Richard glanced around the room with the strained smile of a man realizing control was slipping through his fingers one conversation at a time. Helen always preferred privacy, he said again, almost desperately now. She never wanted recognition. Daniel gave a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. That is interesting, he replied. Because 30 years ago she fought harder than anyone in the room to make sure our work was recognized. I looked down, at my hands resting quietly in my lap. The diamond bracelet Richard bought me for our 40th anniversary suddenly felt heavier than usual. I remembered the night he gave it to me. We had been sitting in the dining room of our lake house while he explained that women our age should enjoy comfort instead of stress. You have done enough, he told me back then. At the time I thought it sounded loving. Now I wondered if it had simply been convenient. Daniel leaned closer toward me. Do you still write? He asked softly. The question caught me off guard. I had not heard anyone ask me that in years. Not since the notebooks disappeared from my desk drawer one by one after Richard moved his home office into the study beside mine. Not since every idea I mentioned somehow returned later as one of his brilliant insights during investor meetings. Not anymore, I answered quietly. Daniel studied me for a moment with visible sadness. That is a loss for more than just you. Before I could respond, a woman wearing an emerald green gown approached our table slowly. She looked to be in her early 40s, polished and confident. Excuse me, she said carefully. Are you really the Helen Parker from the Lexington proposal? I hesitated before nodding once. The woman smiled in disbelief. My father used to talk about that proposal constantly. He said whoever wrote it understood market psychology better than half the executives on Wall Street. Richard immediately stood. I think people are exaggerating old stories tonight. But the woman barely acknowledged him. Her attention stayed on me. You should have received industry awards for that work, she said. Why did you disappear? The question settled over me quietly. I opened my mouth to answer, then stopped. Because for the first time, I realized I did not actually know. Not completely. There had never been one dramatic moment. No screaming fight. No single betrayal. It happened slowly. One sacrifice at a time. One compromise at a time. One introduction where Richard forgot to mention my contribution. One dinner where he answered questions directed at me. One opportunity one declined because our children were young or because Richard needed support or because marriage was supposed to mean building together. Until eventually there was nothing left with my name on it. Richard checked his watch abruptly. Helen, he said tightly, we should probably get going soon. But Daniel Mercer looked directly at him and replied before I could speak. No, he said calmly. I think Helen should stay exactly where she is. Richard did not sit down again after Daniel spoke. He remained standing beside the table with one hand pressed tightly against the back of the empty chair, his wedding ring catching the ballroom lights each time his fingers moved. I had seen that expression before. Usually during financial negotiations or moments when investors questioned him too directly. But tonight felt different. This was not fear of losing money. This was fear of losing ownership over a story he had carefully controlled for decades. Daniel glanced toward the stage where the charity auction would begin soon. There are several people here tonight who would probably enjoy hearing about the early Mercer years, he said casually. Richard gave a short laugh that sounded painfully thin. I doubt anybody wants a history lesson. History matters, Daniel replied, especially when certain names were removed from it. I noticed Richard loosen his tie again. Tiny gestures, tiny cracks. After 42 years of marriage, I had become an expert at reading the smallest changes in him. Across the ballroom, guests continued drifting closer without appearing obvious about it. A few men near the bar kept looking toward me with growing curiosity, as if trying to match my face to stories they had heard long ago. It felt surreal. For years I had walked through Richard's corporate events almost invisible. Wives remembered each other's jewelry, vacations, and grandchildren. Nobody asked me about strategy meetings or expansion models or investor negotiations. Eventually I stopped expecting them to. A server quietly refreshed the water glasses at our table. His polite smile lingered on me slightly longer than before. Respect changes quickly in rooms filled with powerful people. Sometimes all it takes is one important voice saying, "Your name out loud." Daniel folded his hands together. "Do you still have the notebooks?" he asked me suddenly. My breath caught for half a second. Richard looked at me immediately. Too quickly. "What notebooks?" he interrupted. Daniel ignored him. "The black legal notebooks from Boston," he continued. "You carried them everywhere. Every projection, every market forecast, every handwritten strategy." I stared down at the white tablecloth while old memories surfaced one after another. Late nights at the kitchen table after putting the children to bed. Coffee growing cold beside stacks of paperwork. Richard sleeping upstairs while I rewrote presentations before sunrise because investors trusted polished numbers more than instinct. I remembered the notebooks clearly. Thick black covers. My handwriting filling every page. "I kept them," I said quietly. Richard's jaw tightened instantly. Daniel leaned back slowly, almost impressed. "Good," he said, "because half the business theories people praise today came from those notebooks." Nearby conversations faded again. I noticed the woman in the emerald dress staring openly now. Another executive pulled out his phone discreetly, likely searching old company archives. Richard lowered his voice sharply. "Helen, this is becoming unnecessary." I turned toward him calmly. "Unnecessary for who?" The question seemed to hit him harder than I expected. For a moment, he said nothing at all. Then his eyes shifted away from mine. That was when I finally understood something I should have realized years ago. Richard never wanted a partner beside him. He wanted a witness who stayed quiet while he slowly rewrote the story of who built our life together. And tonight, for the first time in decades, the story was beginning to return to its original author. The charity auction began 20 minutes later, but very few people seemed interested in the artwork displayed on the stage anymore. The attention in the ballroom kept drifting back toward our table like a compass needle returning north. Richard checked his phone repeatedly while pretending to follow conversations around him. I recognized the performance. Calm face, tight shoulders, controlled breathing. He was calculating damage now. Across the room, whispers moved quietly between groups of executives and their spouses. A few guests glanced toward me with curiosity, others with sudden respect. It felt strange watching people reconsider my value in real time without knowing anything about me except that a powerful man had confirmed I mattered. Daniel stood when the auction host approached the microphone. "Come with me," he said gently. I looked up in surprise. "Where?" "Closer to the stage." Richard answered before I could. "Helen is fine where she is." Daniel turned slowly toward him. That table was meant to make her disappear. His voice remained calm, but the silence afterward felt sharp enough to cut glass. Then he looked back at me and extended his hand. "You spent too many years in the background already." I stared at his outstretched hand for several seconds. Around us, people were openly watching now, waiting. Richard forced a smile that barely hid the warning in his eyes. The old version of me would have stayed seated. The old version of me would have apologized for making things uncomfortable. But something inside me had shifted tonight. Quietly, permanently. I placed my hand in Daniel's and stood. The movement was small, yet I heard nearby conversations stop immediately. Daniel guided me toward the front of the ballroom, where reserved tables surrounded the stage beneath enormous crystal chandeliers. Every step felt unreal. I could sense eyes following me across the carpet. Some curious, some shocked, some calculating. We stopped beside a table filled with executives from Mercer Holdings. Daniel pulled out a chair beside his own seat and waited for me to sit before taking his place next to me. A woman across the table smiled warmly. "It is wonderful to finally meet you," she said. Finally. Such a simple word. Yet it stayed with me because it implied something important had been delayed. Not denied forever, just delayed. Richard arrived moments later, slower now, carrying the expression of a man entering a room where he no longer controlled the conversation. Nobody stood to greet him. That seemed to unsettle him more than anything else tonight. The auction host began speaking about innovation, leadership, and visionary thinking while waiters poured wine around the table. Daniel leaned slightly toward me. "Do you know how many business schools still study your logistics framework?" he asked quietly. I almost laughed at the absurdity of hearing those words after so many silent years. "I doubt they even know my name." "That was intentional," Daniel replied. I turned toward him slowly. He held my gaze for a moment before continuing. There were rumors back then. People said someone inside your own circle discouraged others from mentioning your involvement publicly. Across the table, Richard suddenly reached for his water glass so quickly that some spilled onto the white tablecloth. Nobody said anything, but I noticed several people looking at him differently now. Not with admiration, not even with pity, with suspicion. And for the first time in our marriage, Richard Whitmore looked like a man standing beside my shadow instead of the other way around. Halfway through the auction dinner, Daniel Mercer stood from his chair and walked toward the stage without warning. The ballroom quieted almost immediately. People respected wealth, but they listened to power. And Daniel Mercer carried both effortlessly. He adjusted the microphone once before smiling politely at the crowd beneath the chandeliers. "Before we continue tonight," he said, "there is someone in this room I would like to recognize." My stomach tightened slightly. Richard stared at the stage with the rigid stillness of a man already anticipating disaster. Daniel continued calmly. "Many years ago, when Mercer Holdings was close to collapse, a young strategist created a recovery framework that changed the future of my company forever." Several executives nodded with interest. Others leaned forward in their chairs. "Most people assumed that work came from a room full of senior advisors," Daniel said. It did not. He turned slightly toward our table. Toward me. It came from one woman. The spotlight operator followed his gaze instinctively, and suddenly warm white light settled over my table. I blinked against the brightness while hundreds of eyes shifted toward me at once. Richard lowered his head slightly, his jaw tightening hard enough for me to see the muscles move beneath his skin. Daniel smiled softly. "Helen Parker Whitmore," he said clearly. "Would you please stand?" For a moment I could not move. My body felt strangely heavy, like part of me still expected someone to say there had been a mistake. But then the woman seated beside me touched my arm gently and whispered, "Please stand." Slowly, I rose from my chair. The ballroom remained silent for half a second before applause began somewhere near the back of the room. Then another table joined in. Then another, until suddenly the entire ballroom was clapping. Not politely, not casually, genuinely. I looked around in disbelief as people I had never met smiled toward me with admiration that felt almost unbearable after so many years of invisibility. Daniel rested one hand against the podium. "Helen developed the distribution strategy that became the foundation for our Midwest expansion in the 1990s. A strategy still studied in graduate business programs today." Several guests turned toward one another in visible surprise. I heard someone near the stage whisper, "That was her?" Daniel continued, "There are people whose names appear on buildings. And then there are people whose ideas quietly build the buildings themselves." The applause grew louder. Across the table, Richard remained seated. He did not clap. He stared at the white linen tablecloth in front of him, as if avoiding eye contact could somehow stop the room from changing around him. Daniel looked directly at me again. "Helen," he said warmly, "thank you for the work you were never properly thanked for." I felt my throat tighten unexpectedly, not because of the recognition itself, but because I realized how long it had been since anyone spoke about my mind with respect instead of inconvenience. The applause continued as I slowly sat back down. And in that moment, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and Chicago's wealthiest executives, I finally understood something painful. Richard had not merely hidden me from the world. He had hidden the world from me. The applause eventually faded, but the atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed completely. People no longer looked past me. They looked toward me. Executives who had ignored me earlier now smiled when our eyes met. A woman from another table approached briefly just to shake my hand before returning to her seat. Even the servers seemed gentler somehow, speaking to me with careful respect as they cleared the dinner plates. It was astonishing how quickly the world adjusted itself once a powerful man validated your existence. Richard barely spoke. He sat beside me in tight silence while the auction continued around us, his expression locked behind the same practiced composure he had used throughout our marriage whenever something threatened his image. But I knew him too well. I noticed the pulse beating quickly near his temple, the way his fingers tapped once against the stem of his water glass before stopping abruptly. He was unraveling quietly. Daniel leaned toward me again after the final auction item sold. "There is a private reception upstairs for senior partners and board members," he said. "I would like you to join us." Richard answered immediately. "Helen is tired. We should head home." Daniel did not even glance at him this time. Helen can decide for herself. The sentence landed softly, yet I felt it move through me like a door opening somewhere deep inside my chest. Because nobody had said words like that to me in years. I looked at Richard carefully. For decades, I had adjusted my preferences around his comfort. Restaurants, vacations, friendships, conversations. Entire pieces of myself quietly reshaped to fit inside the boundaries of his approval. Somewhere along the way, asking what I wanted had stopped feeling natural. I would like to stay, I said calmly. Richard stared at me as though I had spoken in another language. Across the ballroom, guests continued leaving their tables while staff prepared for the private reception upstairs. Daniel stood and offered me his arm politely. After you, he said. As we walked toward the elevators, I caught fragments of conversation floating through the crowd behind us. She created the Mercer model? Why have we never heard of her before? Did Richard Whitmore seriously keep that hidden? The questions followed us softly through the ballroom like smoke. Inside the elevator, mirrored walls reflected the small group traveling upstairs together. Daniel stood beside me while two board members discussed investment projections near the back. Richard remained silent in the corner. He looked older suddenly, smaller somehow, not because he had lost money or influence tonight, but because the version of himself he built depended on me staying invisible. The elevator doors opened onto the top-floor reception lounge overlooking downtown Chicago. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city glowing beneath the night sky, headlights moving like rivers of gold through the streets below. Guests stepped inside carrying champagne glasses and polished smiles, but several conversations paused the moment I entered the room. Daniel placed one hand lightly against the middle of my back and guided me forward. Everyone, he announced warmly. There is someone important I want you to meet properly. And for the first time in more than 40 years, I walked into a room not as Richard Whitmore's wife, but as Helen Parker Whitmore. The reception lounge felt quieter than the ballroom downstairs, but somehow more important. Conversations here carried the careful confidence of people accustomed to making decisions that changed companies, cities, sometimes entire industries. Yet as Daniel Mercer introduced me around the room, I noticed something unexpected. People were not speaking to me politely out of obligation. They were listening, really listening. A gray-haired board member asked about my early market forecasts for Midwest distribution. A woman from a private equity firm wanted to know how I predicted consumer migration patterns before digital analytics existed. Another executive asked whether I still consulted privately. Every question reopened parts of myself I thought had disappeared forever. Richard stayed near the windows overlooking the city, isolated in a small circle of silence that seemed to follow him wherever he moved. Nobody ignored him openly. Wealthy people rarely humiliate each other directly. But the energy around him had shifted. Earlier in the evening, people approached him eagerly. Now conversations ended quickly. Smiles looked strained. Several guests glanced toward him with the cautious distance reserved for men whose reputations suddenly feel unstable. Daniel handed me a glass of sparkling water before lowering his voice slightly. You know, he said, after tonight, people are going to start asking difficult questions. I looked across the room toward Richard. About him. Daniel nodded once. About why someone with your mind disappeared for 4 decades while standing beside a man who built a career in the same industry. I held the glass carefully between my hands. The city lights beyond the windows blurred softly against the dark sky. I stopped fighting for space eventually, I admitted quietly. At first I thought marriage meant sacrifice. Then sacrifice became habit. Daniel studied me for a moment before speaking. Helen, there is a difference between sharing a life and surrendering one. The sentence settled deep inside me because I realized nobody had ever said it aloud before. Not my friends, not my family, not even myself. Across the lounge, Richard finally approached us again. His expression looked exhausted now, stripped of the polished confidence he carried so naturally for most of our marriage. Can we go home? He asked quietly. Not angry, not demanding, just tired. I looked at him for a long moment. This man had once held my hand inside a tiny apartment while we ate takeout Chinese food on borrowed furniture because we could not afford a dining table. We used to stay awake until 2 in the morning talking about the future like it belonged equally to both of us. Somewhere between ambition and success, something in him changed. Or maybe something simply revealed itself slowly over time. I am not ready yet, I answered calmly. Richard lowered his eyes for a second before nodding faintly. Then he walked back toward the windows alone. Daniel remained beside me in comfortable silence while the city glowed beneath us. And standing there high above Chicago, surrounded by powerful strangers who suddenly remembered my value, I finally understood the cruelest part of disappearing inside a marriage. It was not that someone else erased you. It was realizing how long you quietly helped them hold the eraser.